Good morning, St. John's Church. So spectacular to be with you. This is a day that is largely about you, but it is absolutely and mostly about God. What we do, everything that we do today, baptisms, confirmations, receptions, reaffirmations, the banquet prepared for us week in and week out. Of course we are engaged. Of course, at some level, it is about each of us. But it is about God and God's faithfulness. I bring you greetings from all of your friends throughout Maine, and I am delighted to be with you. When Father Nutter was in touch with me a few months ago, he said, "Is there any way that you can come to St. John's? There are people ready to be confirmed." And I said, "Yes, I'll see you on December 3rd. And so here we are. Thank you. The musicians and clergy, or clergy spouses, or surviving widows of spouses, I know who you all are. You cannot answer this question that I'm going to ask, because you know the answer. But for those of you who are not members of the choir, musicians, clergy, or clergy spouses, if I say two names, I'm going to say two names in just a moment. And then I want you to yell back, not yell at me, but say loud enough so we can hear what it is you associate with these names or know about them. Okay? Are you ready to play this little game? John and Charles Wesley. Methodist? Hymns. Anything else? Preaching. England. The colonies. United States. All right. John and Charles Wesley were Anglican clergymen. They were preachers' kids. Their dad was a Church of England priest. They went off to Oxford, and they were devoted to their faith, and they developed a way of praying and a way of caring for people that was very methodical, hence the name Methodist. They wanted the Church of England to grasp on to the renewal that they themselves and others at Oxford and throughout England were experiencing. New music, a little less frozen chosen, and a lot warmer. That's what they desired. They were very much committed to this reforming spirit within the Church of England. What happened is that mostly the institution said, "No, thank you." John Wesley came to what is now Georgia on this great, zealous mission to share the gospel of the people living in what is now modern-day Georgia in this country. It was a colossal failure, and he went back to England dejected and convinced that all of his zeal and his brother's zeal were for naught. What happened, we're talking about the late 1700s right now, what happened is that in England, that fire took off, and thousands of people in English villages became Methodists. They were still part of the Church of England, but they had this expression of warmth and of singing. You mentioned hymns. Charles Wesley is the author of literally thousands of hymns, and we sing probably 100 of them. So Methodism takes root in England. Later, about 25 years later, it begins to take root in the Carolinas and in Virginia and even in Maine. But the Church of England would not work with the leaders of the Methodist Church here in what was by then the United States. And so they became their own church. What John Wesley said back in England was, it's time to go forward in a new way. And so he himself ordained people and the Methodist Church was born. It is the third largest denomination in our country and has done tremendous good in every part of this nation and many other nations. Why all this business about Methodism, you ask? Thomas and Ethel Roberts left Cornwall in the early 1900s. They were miners. Thomas was a miner, a tin miner, and they emigrated to the United States to a little place called Negaunee in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. They, along with thousands of others, mostly Cornish, because of their mining experience, the United States government said, come to this northern part of nowhere where there are buckets and buckets in the earth of iron ore that we need for you to mine so that we can create steel in this country. So Thomas and Ethel had a few children. They came to Negaunee. They had some more children. And in 1918, their youngest daughter was born, and her name was Marion. And Marion grew up with these Cornish parents who had been Methodists, as were their grandparents and great-grandparents. 5 generations of singing people having a zeal for Jesus Christ. Marion grows up singing hymns all the time. At 5 years old, in 1923, a Methodist preacher in Kansas writes a hymn that becomes popular almost overnight, though it took about 10 years. Some of you know it. It's called "Great is Thy Faithfulness." And Marion, born in 1923, she's 5 years old. She remembers at age 10 singing this new hymn in her Methodist church in Negaunee, Michigan. Throughout Marion's life, she has an annoying but very loving way of constantly saying, almost all the time, if someone was joyous, if someone was sad, it didn't matter. She would say, "Great is thy faithfulness. Great is thy Your wife died. I'm so sorry. Great is thy faithfulness. You're getting married. You just had a baby. Great is thy faithfulness." I can say it was annoying because Marion was my grandmother. And Marion Brown lived and breathed hymns. She did not teach me faith. She helped me to catch faith. And she did that largely by continually quoting lines of hymns. But "Great is thy faithfulness" was the one that she quoted most often, that phrase, "Great is thy faithfulness." I tell you all of this story because in this first letter of Paul to the Corinthians, the very first part, we know he's written many letters, but we know that there are 2 of them, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. This morning, on this first Sunday of Advent, when we're celebrating the richness of your parish church and so many of you ready to reaffirm your faith, ready to be initiated, baptized into the faith, into this context, St. Paul comes to us this morning. And what St. Paul says is that God is faithful. So when I said at the outset of this sermon that of course this is partly about each of you, and it's partly about St. John's, it's really about God. And that's what Marion Brown was saying when she constantly said, "Great is thy faithfulness," all the time. She was helping me and everybody else whom she loved point in the direction, orient their souls and their heart and their minds in the direction of God. What St. Paul says, picking up from the entire Old Testament, is that God created a covenant with God's people, and God is not going to let go of that God is going to be constantly faithful. And so what St. Paul says is that this work of Jesus Christ that is in you is strengthened in you because you are a community. That's what he's saying this morning in these first few lines of this first letter to the Corinthians. I give thanks to my God always for you because of the grace that God has given you. God is faithful. Any strengthening of Christ's testimony, any deepening of the gospel among the Corinthians, it's due to God's faithfulness. That's what St. Paul is saying. And he states clearly and quite poignantly, actually, as he begins this letter of counsel, and later, if you'll read the whole thing, you'll see that he also has to do some correcting. Grace has been given to you. And the grace is never appropriated individually. It's not just for me or for you. It is always a communal appropriation. It's an insertion into the whole community. It's a regard for fellowship with each other, fellowship that is joyous, and fellowship that is also accompanying others who suffer. This morning, as we baptize, as we confirm, as we recognize people who have come to us from other Christian faith traditions, as many of you reaffirm the promises of your baptism, let every single one of us bear in mind that even if we are not engaged personally as a baptizand, as someone getting confirmed, as someone being received, as someone reaffirming their faith, every single one of us here is engaged in this because we too are making promises. There isn't a single one of us here this morning that isn't engaged in saying, "Great is thy faithfulness." May it be so this day and forevermore. Amen.